Good morning, everybody. It's August 11th, 2026, and something happened in Tehran over the last 24 hours that tells you everything you need to know about who actually won this war. Iran's supreme leader just fired his entire top military command and replaced it in a single afternoon. 6 decrees, 6 new commanders one morning, and buried inside that reshuffle is an admission Iran will never say out loud on state television. The men who used to run this war are dead. The ones left standing don't trust their own communications anymore. And the new guy sitting at the top of the Revolutionary Guard has a resume that includes alleged ties to the 1983 Beirut bombing and the 1994 bombing of a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires. That's who they had to reach for. Not because he's their best option, because he's one of the only guys left standing with enough rank and enough history to hold the seat. And less than 48 hours before that reshuffle dropped, the President of the United States went on social media and did something almost nobody's talking about yet. And it might be the most humiliating 5 sentences Iran has absorbed all year. Iran's negotiators asked the United States for compensation, for war damages. After 5 months of getting bombed into the Stone Age, after losing control of a Strait of Hormuz, they used to run like their own personal toll booth. After burning through a huge chunk of their missile and drone inventory trying to prove a point that never landed, Iran's own representatives sat down at a negotiating table and asked Washington to write them a check. Today, we're going to break down exactly how a regime that spent 47 years threatening to wipe countries off the map ended up begging for money, rebuilding its entire war cabinet from a body count, and quietly accepting terms. It would have called an act of war a year ago. So let's set the stage, because if you haven't been following this closely, the scale of what's happened here is honestly kind of hard to wrap your head around. This whole thing kicked off on February 28th, 2026. When the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise campaign, Operation Epic Fury on the American side, Operation Roaring Lion on the Israeli side. In the first 12 hours alone, close to 900 individual strikes hit targets across Iran. And this wasn't your standard opening salvo aimed at radar sites and airfields. This was a decapitation strike aimed straight at the head of the snake. Iran's supreme leader at the time, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had run the country for 36 years, was killed in a strike on his compound in central Tehran, along with his daughter, son-in-law, and grandson. Alongside him, in that same opening window, somewhere around 40 of Iran's most senior officials were wiped out. IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour, gone. Defense Minister Aziz Nasserzadeh, gone. Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, Abdolrahim Mousavi, gone. Ali Shamkhani, one of Khamenei's closest advisors, gone. It is genuinely one of the most effective decapitation operations in modern military history. And if you're keeping score, that's the second time in less than a year Iran's leadership got gutted like this, because there was already a 12-day war back in June of last year that took a huge bite out of their nuclear program before this even started. Now here's the thing about decapitating a regime like this. It doesn't end the fight, it just changes who's fighting it. Within days, Iran scrambled to fill the vacuum. Khamenei's own son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was installed as the new supreme leader, which, if you think about it for 2 seconds, is a wild thing to process. The son of the man who just got assassinated by American and Israeli air power is now the guy running the response. And down in the IRGC, a veteran commander named Ahmad Vahidi got the call to take over as head of the Revolutionary Guard almost immediately, because his predecessor was one of the guys who didn't make it out of February 28th alive. Vahidi wasn't some fresh face. He'd already served as interior minister. He'd already run the defense ministry, and earlier in his career he commanded the Quds Force, which, if you don't know, is Iran's external operations and proxy warfare arm, the guys who actually build and run networks like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the various Iraqi and Yemeni militias. Argentina, by the way, has an outstanding arrest request for Vahidi tied to the 1994 bombing of the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, an attack that killed 85 people. So think about that for a second. Iran's emergency replacement pick, back in early March, was already a man wanted internationally for a terror bombing 3 decades old. That was Iran's version of a backup quarterback. And it wasn't just leadership. Iranian state media itself reported that a strike on the morning of March 1st killed Chief of Staff Abdolrahim Mousavi. And for a brief chaotic window, there were even reports that former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad had been killed too, though later reporting walked that one back and confirmed he survived. That's how fast and how confused the first 72 hours of this war were. Intelligence sources told American outlets that as many as 40 senior Iranian officials were killed in that opening weekend alone, a number so large it basically wiped out an entire generation of the regime's military and intelligence leadership in a single sitting. Israeli officials say the operation involved roughly 200 fighter jets in the initial sortie, which at the time was described as the largest single operational mission in Israeli Air Force history. The stated goal, according to Trump's own social media post at the time, was fourfold: stop Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon, destroy its missile arsenal and production capability, degrade its proxy networks across the region, and force a fundamental change in how Tehran operates. 3 of those 4 goals are still very much in progress 5 months later. The 4th one, forcing a change in how Tehran operates, might actually be the one this compensation request just accidentally proved is already working. And that backup quarterback just got permanently confirmed and promoted 5 months later on August 10th, alongside 5 brand new senior appointments, because more of Iran's command structure kept getting hollowed out in the months between March and now. Ali Abdullahi was named chief of staff of the entire armed forces. Kiyomar's Haydari became his deputy. Mostafa Izzadi was installed as Vahidi's own deputy inside the IRGC. A rear admiral named Ali Ismail took over the IRGC Navy. And Hossein Teb, a former IRGC intelligence chief, was handed control of the Basij, which is the volunteer paramilitary arm the regime uses to put boots on the ground domestically and crush protests. On top of all that, Mohsen Rezai, another old guard IRGC figure, was installed as Khamenei's personal representative on the Supreme National Security Council. That's not a normal wartime reshuffle. That's a regime that has lost so many senior people, it's had to go back to its bench, its retirees, its politically loyal old guard, just to have bodies capable of holding the titles. One counterterrorism analyst who spoke to reporters this week put it about as bluntly as you can. The timing and the language of these decrees signal Tehran isn't preparing for a settlement. It's preparing for a prolonged fight it can barely staff. But here's where it gets almost funny in a dark sort of way. Because at the exact same moment Iran is scraping the bottom of its command structure barrel, its own diplomats are sitting across a table quietly asking the United States for money. On August 10th, President Trump posted directly about it. He said, representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran were asking for compensation for damage done to them during, in his words, the last 5-month military conflict. And he pointed out that compensation had never once been mentioned in any of the actual negotiations or meetings. Read that again. Iran, in the middle of a war, it started by trying to close one of the most important oil choke points on planet Earth. In the middle of a war where it fired ballistic missiles at you. U.S. bases across 3 different countries is now asking the country that bombed its nuclear program, killed its supreme leader, and sank its warships to reimburse it for the damage. It's the geopolitical equivalent of breaking into somebody's house, getting shot by their dog, and then suing them for the medical bill. And Trump didn't even really dignify it with anger. He just kind of shrugged it off in public, which honestly might be more embarrassing for Tehran than if he'd threatened to level another city. So let's actually rewind the clock and walk through how Iran got from launching a war it thought it could win to begging for a reimbursement check. Because the middle of this story is just as insane as where it ends up. After that brutal opening in February and early March, both sides went back and forth for weeks. Strikes, retaliation, more strikes, until Iran finally agreed to a 2-week ceasefire in early April, tied specifically to reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which had been effectively shut down since the war began and was strangling roughly 1/5 of the entire planet's oil shipments. That ceasefire held for a while, on and off, through a rolling set of negotiations mediated by Oman, until things fell apart again over the summer. By July, the United States had reimposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports, and Central Command confirmed it had redirected north of 44 commercial vessels away from Iranian waters as part of that blockade. Iran, true to form, didn't sit quietly. Its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps put out statement after statement insisting that as long as American officials kept talking about the waterway like it belonged to them, Iran would keep striking and keep trying to control it. Which, sure, that sounds tough on paper, except every single time Iran tried to back that talk up with action, it got demolished. Iran's larger air defense systems, the big fixed radar-guided batteries like the Bavar 373, got picked apart one by one because a radar has to emit to see anything, and a fixed sight can't run away from a JDAM. Iran's Navy mauled. One of its newer frigates, the Dina, got hit by a torpedo from a U.S. submarine off the coast of Sri Lanka in early March and went down with more than 100 sailors still unaccounted for. Its integrated air defense network gone. Its ballistic missile stockpile, according to open-source estimates, dropped from somewhere around 5,000 missiles at the start of the war to roughly 2,000 by midsummer. Its drone inventory took a similar hit, cut by more than half. Let's actually get into the hardware for a second, because it explains a lot about why Iran couldn't hold this line no matter how many statements it put out. Iran's air defense doctrine, going back years, was built around big, fixed, radar-guided surface-to-air systems. Things like the Bavar 373. which is basically their homegrown attempt at matching something like the American Patriot system. The problem with that entire class of weapon is baked into how it works. To track and engage an incoming aircraft or missile, the radar has to actively emit a signal, and the second it does, it's basically raising its hand and shouting its exact coordinates to every electronic warfare aircraft and radar-homing missile in the sky. Once American and Israeli forces started systematically hunting and suppressing those radar sites, Iran's entire integrated air defense network unraveled in sequence, one site at a time, because a fixed position can't run, and a radar that stays silent is a radar that isn't doing its job. That's the exact same vulnerability that doomed Iraq's air defenses back in the early 2000s, and it's the same one that's been getting exploited in this war. Iran's Navy fared even worse. One of its newer frigates, the Dana, commissioned back in 2021 and fresh off participating in a multinational naval exercise, got hit by a torpedo fired from a U.S. Navy submarine off the coast of Sri Lanka in early March, and went down fast, with more than 100 of its roughly 180 sailors never recovered. When your surface fleet can get quietly torpedoed from underneath before it even sees the threat coming, that's not a fair fight anymore, that's a mismatch. To be fair, none of this came free for the United States either, and it's worth being honest about that instead of pretending this was a clean, costless campaign. Reporting out of Washington in early August indicated the Pentagon had burned through nearly 80% of its THAAD interceptor inventory compared to pre-war stock levels, and roughly half of its Patriot interceptor stockpile, prompting senior commanders to privately warn that overall munitions reserves were getting dangerously thin. Independent estimates from defense analysts put America's pre-war Patriot stockpile at somewhere around 2,200 of its most modern interceptor variants and roughly 450 THAAD missiles total. So burning through that much of it in 5 months tells you just how sustained and expensive this campaign has actually been on both sides of the fight. But here's the difference that actually matters strategically. America's shortage is a supply chain and manufacturing problem, something that gets fixed with defense contracts, factory throughput, and time. Iran's shortage is a command, leadership, and force generation problem, something that doesn't get fixed nearly as easily, because you can restock a missile in a warehouse a lot faster than you can rebuild 40 years of institutional military experience that just got wiped out in a single weekend. And through all of this, Iran kept issuing the same kind of statements you'd expect from a boxer getting knocked down for the 4th time in a round, insisting he's totally fine and definitely winning on points. Iran's wartime military command chief, Major General Ali Abdullahi, the same guy who just got promoted to chief of staff in this latest reshuffle, put out a statement at the start of August accusing the United States of, quote, moving at an accelerating pace to fan the flames of a full-scale regional war, which is a genuinely incredible thing to say when you're the side that's had your supreme leader assassinated, your navy sunk, your air defenses vaporized, and your entire senior command replaced twice in 5 months. That's not fanning the flames, my friend. That's called mopping up. It's the same energy as getting your lunch money taken every single day for a semester and telling everyone at the lunch table you're just letting the other kid have a turn. Meanwhile, the actual diplomacy was crawling forward, mostly through Oman, because Iran refuses to admit it's talking to Washington directly, insisting instead that all the real negotiating is happening with Muscat as the go-between. By early August, Iran and Oman had reportedly agreed on coordinates for new shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz, inbound traffic routed through a northern lane inside Iranian waters, outbound traffic through a southern lane coordinated with Oman. Iranian state media rushed to frame this as a win, claiming the deal would ban any American or Israeli-linked vessel from using the strait entirely and slap violators with fines worth up to 20% of their cargo value. Sounds bold, right? Except buried in the same reporting is the actual condition that makes the whole thing work, which is that this entire arrangement only kicks in once Washington lifts its blockade of Iranian ports. In other words, Iran doesn't get to unilaterally ban anybody from anything. It gets to write a strongly worded press release about banning people, contingent entirely on the United States deciding on its own schedule to ease up. That's not sovereignty. That's a hostage, negotiating the terms of their own ransom and calling it a diplomatic victory. And Iran's own parliament couldn't even fully agree on what was actually happening. A senior lawmaker on Iran's National Security and Foreign Policy Commission went out of his way to publicly insist that the Oman talks were not, in his words, in any way about reopening the strait, and that real reopening would require the U.S. to end its threats, lift the blockade entirely, and leave the region first, which tells you the domestic political pressure inside Iran right now is intense. There are hardliners who cannot stomach the idea of their own government quietly conceding to American terms, so officials are having to publicly deny the very deal their own negotiators are hammering out, sometimes within the same week. President Trump, for his part, has been almost annoyingly relaxed about the whole thing in public, telling reporters the negotiations were, quote, moving along very nicely, and saying just last week that he thinks the war has, quote, got to end pretty soon because he doesn't believe Iran, quote, can go much longer. And on August 1st, just to remind everybody exactly who's setting the pace here, Trump announced the U.S. military was, in his words, locked and loaded and ready to hit Iran at levels of military terror, strength and power not seen since World War II, before turning around hours later and canceling the planned strikes because, according to him, Iran and several other Middle Eastern countries had personally asked him to hold off. Whether that's exactly how it went down or not, think about the position that puts Iran in. The President of the United States gets to publicly threaten total annihilation, then publicly announce he's being merciful, and Iran has to just sit there and accept the framing, because they don't have the leverage to argue with either version of that story. Now let's actually dig into the technical side of why Iran ended up in this position, because it's not just about who has the bigger stick, it's about what that stick can actually do. A lot of Iran's strategy, this entire war, has revolved around a concept we've talked about before on this channel, proxy warfare and asymmetric pressure. When you can't beat a modern integrated air force in a straight fight, you don't try. You go underneath it. Fast attack boats hiding in coastal warehouses that look like garages for oversized base boats. Shoulder-fired missiles instead of massive radar-guided systems that can be tracked and destroyed the second they light up. Cyber attacks on infrastructure instead of open declarations of war. It's a smart strategy on paper because it's cheap, it's deniable, and it's genuinely hard to intercept every single time. But here's the problem with betting your entire national strategy on asymmetric warfare. It only buys you time. It doesn't win wars. It's the difference between a defensive lineman who can occasionally sack the quarterback on a busted play and an offense that can actually put points on the board. Iran spent 5 months getting the occasional sack. The United States spent 5 months systematically dismantling the entire stadium. And that's really the story hiding underneath every headline this week. Iran isn't negotiating from a position of strength dressed up as compromise. Iran is negotiating from a position of near total collapse dressed up, very carefully, in the language of sovereignty and mutual agreement. Every part of this reshuffle, every part of this Oman deal, every part of this compensation request is Iran trying to save face while quietly accepting terms that would have been unthinkable to the regime that existed on February 27th, the day before all of this started. Think about what a request for war damage compensation actually signals strategically. It's not a request made from strength. Strong regimes that still believe they're winning don't ask their enemy to help rebuild what got destroyed. They ask for time. They ask for territory. They ask for concessions on the thing they were actually fighting about. In this case, Iran's nuclear program and its proxy networks. Instead, Iran's negotiators showed up and, according to Trump's own account, asked for a check. That's not the language of a regime playing chess. That's the language of a regime that's run out of moves and is hoping the other side feels generous. There's one more thread worth pulling before we get to the reshuffle, because it shows the same pattern of forced concession playing out on the water instead of in the command bunkers. Even while the Oman talks were supposedly progressing nicely, the United Arab Emirates reported that a tanker belonging to the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company got hit by a missile while transiting the strait. No casualties, but a clear signal that even during active negotiations, the waterway still isn't fully secure and Iran still isn't fully in control of what happens along its own coastline. That's the awkward reality Iran's negotiators are sitting with every time they go back to that table. They can't even guarantee good behavior from their own side long enough to close the deal cleanly, whether that's because of rogue elements, because of proxy actors operating without central coordination, or because parts of the IRGC itself haven't gotten the memo that the war is supposed to be winding down. Any way you slice it, that's not the posture of a government firmly in control of its own military. It's the posture of a government negotiating an exit while still trying to figure out whether everyone under its own flag is actually listening to it anymore. Even the reshuffle itself, if you strip away the state media framing, tells the same story. Khamenei's decree appointing Vahidi didn't just hand him a job, it explicitly tasked him with achieving, quote, maximum deterrence and maintaining smart readiness for powerful offensive operations against enemies, while also calling for strengthening what the decree called ideological and cultural foundations within the force. Read between the lines on that second part for a second. When a wartime leader's marching orders to his new top general include a reminder to shore up piety, insight, and revolutionary spirit among the ranks, that's not the language you use with a force that's confident and cohesive. That's the language you use when morale inside your own officer corps is cracking and you're worried about loyalty as much as you're worried about capability. You don't have to lecture a winning army about its revolutionary spirit. You lecture a losing one. It's also worth remembering exactly who Ahmad Vahidi is, because his background tells you a lot about what kind of fight Iran is actually preparing for behind closed doors. Before any of this, Vahidi spent years commanding the Quds Force, which is the external arm of the IRGC responsible for building, funding, and directing Iran's entire proxy network across the region, everything from Hezbollah in Lebanon to various militias in Iraq and Yemen. That's not a background in conventional warfare. That's a background in exactly the kind of dispersed, deniable, asymmetric pressure campaign Iran has been running since its conventional forces started collapsing. Putting a career proxy warfare architect in charge of the entire Revolutionary Guard, and then formally cementing that decision 5 months later with 5 more loyalist appointments around him, isn't the move of a regime preparing to sign a clean peace deal and walk away. It's the move of a regime preparing to fight the next phase of this conflict through exactly the kind of shadow tactics we've talked about before. Shell companies, smuggled weapons shipments, cyber attacks on infrastructure, small boat harassment, anything that doesn't require the conventional military capability it just lost. So let's zoom all the way out and actually connect the dots here, because this is where it stops being a list of headlines and starts being a coherent picture of exactly how this ends. Iran built its entire wartime posture on 3 pillars: deterrence through its missile and drone stockpile, control of the Strait of Hormuz as economic leverage over the entire planet, and a layer of senior commanders experienced enough to run a coordinated multi-front resistance. Over 5 months, the United States and Israel systematically dismantled all 3. Not with one knockout blow, but with sustained, grinding pressure that never let Iran regenerate faster than it was losing ground. The missile stockpile got cut roughly in half. The Strait of Hormuz went from an Iranian choke point to a jointly monitored shipping lane that only functions with American permission. And the senior command got wiped out not once, but effectively twice, forcing the regime to reach first for a man wanted internationally for a decades-old terror bombing, and now, 5 months later, to formally cement that same man's position alongside 5 other replacements just to keep the lights on at the top. Think about the sequence one more time, because it really is remarkable when you lay it out end to end. Regime leadership assassinated in the opening hours. Nearly 40 senior officials wiped out in a single weekend. A Navy frigate torpedoed and sunk with over 100 sailors lost. An air defense network methodically dismantled site by site over months. A ballistic missile stockpile cut roughly in half. A drone inventory cut by more than half. A naval blockade that redirected dozens of commercial vessels away from Iranian ports entirely. And at the end of all of it, the same regime that opened this war, vowing to close the Strait of Hormuz to the entire world, is now asking its enemy for a reimbursement check while quietly accepting a shipping arrangement that only functions with American sign-off. If you'd read that timeline to someone back on February 27th, the day before any of this started, they'd have told you it was fiction. That's the actual scale of what got forced here, and it's happening in plain sight, dressed up in press releases and parliamentary statements designed to make it sound like business as usual. What's left for Iran is exactly what we've talked about on this channel before with proxy strategies. When you can't win the conventional fight, you disperse, you go passive, you go deniable, and you try to make the cost of continued pressure too expensive for the other side to keep paying, even if you can't actually stop them. That's the real function of everything Iran is doing right now. The shoulder-fired missile purchases, the small boat harassment, the cyber intrusions, the parliamentary posturing about banning American ships from a strait it doesn't fully control anymore. None of it is designed to defeat American power. All of it is designed to make American power annoying enough to use that Washington eventually just walks away and calls it a win. And to be fair to Iran, that's not a crazy bet. It's basically the only card they have left to play. But a request for war damage compensation isn't part of that strategy. It's a crack in it. It's the moment the tough talk runs face first into the actual balance sheet. And somebody in that negotiating room decided that admitting the cost out loud, even quietly, even through a mediator, was worth more than pretending the damage never happened. There's also a longer-term angle worth thinking about here, because wars like this one don't just get decided on the battlefield, they get decided in how a population reacts once the smoke clears. Iran is a country of roughly 92 million people, and by most outside estimates, a relatively small slice of that population, somewhere in the range of 10% or so, is genuinely irreversibly committed to the current regime's ideology. That still leaves the overwhelming majority of the country as people who, in a lot of cases, would rather see a different kind of government entirely, but who have been systematically disarmed and controlled for decades by the very security apparatus that just got gutted in this war. It's a strange kind of opportunity hiding inside a tragedy. A regime that just lost its most experienced commanders, that's publicly asking its enemy for money, that's had to promote a man wanted for international terrorism just to fill a chair, is also, by definition, a regime that is more vulnerable to internal pressure than it has been in years. Whether anything comes of that is a separate conversation entirely, and it's one worth having. But it's impossible to ignore that The same 5 months that forced Iran into this humiliating diplomatic position also cracked open the foundation the regime uses to keep its own population in line. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Is what we're watching right now an Iranian regime buying time to regroup, rebuild, and come back stronger under new, more radicalized leadership? Or are we watching the slow motion unraveling of a government that no longer has the capacity to sustain the confrontation it started? Both of those futures are on the table right now, and honestly, the next few months of how this Hormuz deal actually gets implemented, whether the blockade genuinely lifts, whether Iran quietly drops any remaining nuclear ambitions, or just hides them better this time, is going to tell us a lot more than any press release out of Tehran ever will. What we do know for certain is that the Iran sitting at the negotiating table today is not the Iran that launched this war back in February. That Iran believed it could close the Strait of Hormuz and hold the global economy hostage. This Iran is asking for a reimbursement check and hoping nobody notices how far it's fallen. What do you think happens next? Does this new command structure dig in for a longer fight, or is this the beginning of the actual end of the confrontation? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one of them, and if you want to stay caught up on where this goes from here, go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next update the moment it happens. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.